In the early hours of a winter morning, while most of the city was still asleep, a short message began circulating among a small group of accredited observers. It was not announced at a podium. It was not read aloud on camera. It arrived quietly through official channels, and it carried a tone that was measured, restrained, and unmistakably deliberate. The message did not explain. It did not defend. It did not deny. Instead, it acknowledged that something had shifted. For years, silence had been the preferred response. When questions surfaced, they were met with distance. When stories appeared, they were allowed to pass without comment. This approach had been consistent, almost rigid, and it created the impression that whatever was happening beyond the palace walls was no longer the concern of the institution itself. But silence only works until it no longer does. In recent days, that balance appeared to change. A series of events, unfolding quickly and largely outside official settings, began to draw attention not because of what was confirmed, but because of what was suddenly being discussed. Public commentary intensified. Online speculation accelerated. Familiar names resurfaced, not as centerpieces, but as parts of a wider conversation about influence, responsibility, and the consequences of long-running decisions. What made this moment different was not a single claim or report. It was the sense that private matters were beginning to carry public weight again. Observers noted the timing. Others focused on the wording. Some questioned why now, after so long, there was even an acknowledgement at all. The message itself did not offer conclusions. It did not outline steps. It simply made clear that observation was ongoing, that records were being kept, and that personal regret, however genuine, does not erase public consequence. That distinction mattered. This was not framed as reconciliation. It did not signal punishment. It suggested something else entirely, a boundary being restated, a line being clarified, and perhaps most importantly, a reminder that when personal lives intersect with institutional legacy, the response is rarely emotional and almost never immediate. This is where the discussion begins to shift, not toward answers, but toward understanding why this story has not faded, and why, after years of quiet distance, attention has returned to a situation many believed was already settled. When you're ready, type and I'll continue. What followed that brief acknowledgement was a rapid effort, largely unseen, to place recent developments into context. To understand why the silence broke, even in such a limited way, it helps to step back and look at how the situation reached this point. For more than half a decade, the relationship between the institution and the former working members who stepped away had been defined by distance. After their departure, a clear strategy emerged. There would be no ongoing commentary, no rebuttals, no point-by-point responses to interviews, documentaries, or opinion pieces. The belief was that engagement would only prolong conflict and invite further escalation. Over time, this approach hardened into something close to policy. During those years, public narratives developed almost entirely outside official channels. Media coverage fluctuated between sympathy and skepticism. Supporters framed the departure as a search for independence. Critics questioned motives and methods. Inside the institution, however, the focus shifted inward, toward continuity, stability, and the management of future leadership. What happened beyond that boundary was treated as separate. That separation began to feel less secure in mid-January, when a cluster of events unfolded in quick succession. None of them, taken alone, would have required a response. Together, they created a situation that senior figures reportedly found difficult to ignore. First came reports of a public disagreement in a neighborhood far removed from royal settings. It was not framed as a scandal at the time, just an uncomfortable moment observed by bystanders. Within hours, commentary online began to attach broader meaning to the scene, reading it as a sign of deeper strain. Then came a second development. Excerpts attributed to a private conversation appeared briefly in the press. These passages, which were later removed, were notable not for specific claims, but for their tone. They suggested reflection, frustration, and a reassessment of past assumptions. They also introduced names and dynamics that had previously remained at the edges of public discussion. By the morning, reports emerged that living arrangements had changed and that legal consultations were underway. Again, none of this was confirmed through formal statements, but within institutional circles, the accumulation mattered. The situation was no longer just about reputation or media narratives. It touched on questions of responsibility, particularly where children were involved. According to public commentary from sources familiar with internal processes, senior advisors viewed this moment as different from earlier controversies. The concern was not whether past choices were right or wrong, but whether inaction could now be seen as neglect. When situations involve minors connected, even symbolically, to an institution, the threshold for response shifts. Behind closed doors, briefings were reportedly requested. not emergency meetings in the dramatic sense, but structured updates designed to assess risk, precedent, and potential obligations. These discussions were said to include legal advisors, private secretaries, and senior family members who have long played stabilizing roles. The language used in those settings, according to observers, was careful. There was no rush to assign blame, no appetite for public confrontation. Instead, the focus was on documentation, what had been said publicly, what had been implied, what had been recorded, and how all of it might be interpreted later in courts in history or by future generations. One recurring concern was the idea of precedent. Institutions like this do not respond only to the present moment. They respond to how the response itself will be used as a reference point. A gesture meant as compassion can later be framed as endorsement. Silence can be read as avoidance. Engagement can become expectation. This is why the acknowledgement, when it came, was so restrained. It did not validate any particular account. It did not deny that distress existed. It simply clarified that observation does not equal acceptance, and that personal experiences, however painful, do not exist outside public consequence when they intersect with legacy. Another layer to the context is the role of internal frameworks that were quietly developed in previous years. Long after the initial departure, work continued on guidelines addressing what re-engagement, if any, might look like. These were not reconciliation plans. They were contingency measures, designed for scenarios involving security, reputation, and the welfare of younger generations. Such frameworks are rarely discussed publicly, but they reflect an understanding that separation does not erase connection entirely. Titles, lineage, and public interest create ongoing links, whether welcomed or not. Managing those links requires structure, not sentiment. By mid-January, according to commentary from those close to the process, it became clear that existing assumptions were no longer sufficient. The conversation had moved beyond whether individuals might return to public roles. It was now about safeguarding standards, oversight, and the prevention of further instability. This is where the situation began to change, not through dramatic announcements, but through a recalibration of attention. The institution was no longer looking backward, asking how things went wrong. It was looking forward, asking how to prevent similar patterns from repeating. At this point, many people started asking questions, not just about what had happened, but about what might happen and who, if anyone, would speak with authority. The answers were not immediate, but the shift from silence to observation marked a subtle, yet important, turning point in how this story would continue to unfold. As attention widened, the discussion entered a more uncertain phase. This was no longer just about timelines or isolated moments. It became about interpretation and about how much meaning could reasonably be assigned to fragments of information that were never intended for public analysis. Much of the conversation centered on personal reassessment. Public commentary noted that the tone of the recently circulated remarks, however incomplete or contested, differed from earlier public messaging. Instead of certainty, there appeared to be hesitation. Instead of confidence, there was reflection. For some observers, this suggested growth. For others, it raised questions about what had changed and why it took so long. One recurring theme in online discussion was influence. Not influence in a dramatic or conspiratorial sense, but the quieter kind that shapes access, schedules, and perception over time. Commentators began revisiting old photographs, past associations, and professional relationships that had once seemed unremarkable. None of this amounted to proof of anything, but it contributed to a broader sense that decisions were not made in isolation. At the same time, there was growing discomfort with how quickly narratives were hardening. Some voices cautioned against treating personal reflections as confessions or drawing firm conclusions from second-hand accounts. They pointed out that stress, emotional upheaval, and private conflict can all distort perception, especially when filtered through media cycles designed to amplify tension. This caution mattered because the stakes were shifting. The discussion was no longer confined to adults who had chosen public lives. It increasingly touched on children who did not. Questions began to surface about environment, stability, and continuity. Again, nothing was formally alleged, but concern does not require certainty to exist. Legal analysts, speaking in general terms rather than about specific filings, noted that when families span jurisdictions and public roles, even routine changes can attract scrutiny. This does not imply wrongdoing. It reflects the reality that complex lives generate complex oversight, particularly when public interest is involved. Within institutional circles, according to public commentary, there was an awareness that speculation itself can become a force. Unchecked narratives can solidify into assumptions, which later become difficult to correct. This was part of the reason observation was emphasized over engagement. Watching allows for documentation. Engagement risks escalation. Another question gaining traction was whether acknowledgement implied future action. Some interpreted the message as a warning. Others saw it as a protective measure designed to draw a line without crossing it. There was also discussion about timing. Why respond now and not earlier? The most common answer offered was not about content, but about accumulation. Moments add up. Patterns form. At a certain point, even distance becomes a decision that must be reconsidered. Throughout this phase, certain figures were notably absent from public commentary. Their silence became a subject in itself. Analysts suggested that restraint was intentional, signaling that responses would come through process rather than personality. In institutions built on continuity, individuals speak less than structures. There was also renewed attention on internal advisory roles that rarely make headlines. These positions exist precisely to handle moments like this, when emotional narratives collide with long-term responsibility. Their work is slow, procedural, and often invisible, but it shapes outcomes more than any single statement. As the discussion evolved, it became clear that no one was rushing toward resolution. There were too many variables, too many perspectives, and too much at stake. Instead, the situation settled into a holding pattern. Observation continued. Documentation expanded. Legal and ethical frameworks were reviewed, not because action was imminent, but because preparation is part of duty. This period of uncertainty frustrated some observers. In a media environment accustomed to rapid answers, waiting felt evasive, but others recognized the pattern. When institutions pause, it is often because they are deciding not what is easiest, but what is least damaging over time. What followed only added to the complexity. As public interest persisted, subtle patterns began to emerge, not in official announcements, but in who was consulted, what was quietly adjusted, and which priorities were emphasized behind the scenes. These patterns did not confirm any single narrative, but they suggested that the story was no longer static. This is why the discussion did not fade after a few news cycles. It continued because it touched on enduring questions about responsibility, influence, and the limits of personal choice when public legacy is involved. And as those questions lingered, attention naturally shifted toward the structures designed to respond when personal decisions ripple outward. The story at this stage was not about conclusions. It was about watching closely enough to understand what might come. As the days passed, the focus slowly moved from isolated remarks to broader patterns that had been forming for years, often unnoticed at the time. These patterns did not point to a single event or decision. Instead, they suggested a gradual narrowing of influence, a tightening of circles, and a shift in how access and authority were managed. Observers began to notice that many of the questions now being asked were not new. They had appeared before, briefly, and then faded. At earlier points, concerns about advisors, intermediaries, and informal networks had surfaced in commentary and reporting, only to be dismissed as speculation or rivalry. What changed in this moment was not the existence of those questions, but the context in which they were being revisited. Public discussion increasingly centered on the idea of control versus autonomy, not control in a legal sense, but in a practical one. Who schedules meetings? Who filters information? Who decides which opportunities are presented and which are quietly removed? In high-profile lives, these roles carry weight, even when they remain out of sight. None of this established wrongdoing, but it highlighted how easily perception can be shaped when a small number of people manage access to a much larger audience. Analysts noted that this dynamic is common in entertainment, politics, and philanthropy. It becomes problematic only when IT goes unexamined for too long. Another pattern that drew attention was isolation. Over time, public appearances became more controlled. Interactions with extended family grew less frequent. Long-standing professional relationships appeared to end without explanation. Again, these changes could be interpreted in many ways. Some saw them as a search for independence. Others viewed them as warning signs of overconsolidation. This is where tension began to rise, not because of any single claim, but because multiple threads were starting to align. The same names appeared repeatedly in different contexts. The same strategies seemed to repeat across projects and platforms. The same defensive responses emerged whenever scrutiny increased. Within institutional settings, according to public commentary, this alignment triggered closer review. Patterns matter because they inform risk assessment. An isolated incident can be dismissed. A repeated structure invites evaluation. At the same time, there was growing awareness that public reaction was shifting. The tone of commentary softened in some areas and hardened in others. Support did not disappear, but it became more cautious. Critics became less accusatory and more analytical. The conversation matured, moving away from personal attacks towards structural questions. Media coverage reflected this change. Instead of headline-driven outrage, longer analyses began to appear. These pieces avoided definitive language. They focused on timelines, relationships, and the mechanics of influence. They asked how narratives are built, maintained, and eventually questioned. Another source of tension came from the contrast between public branding and private accounts. When carefully curated images meet conflicting descriptions, uncertainty grows. Audiences are not always looking for scandal. Often, they are looking for coherence. When coherence breaks down, trust erodes quietly. This erosion was evident in the response of partner organizations and affiliated entities. Without issuing statements, some adjusted their involvement. Projects were delayed, appearances were postponed, promotional plans were revised. None of this was framed as judgment, it was framed as prudence. Industry observers noted that such retreats are rarely dramatic. They happen through scheduling changes, contract reviews, and internal conversations. They signal caution, not condemnation, but they also reflect a desire to avoid entanglement in unresolved narratives. Inside the institution, tension manifested differently. The concern was less about reputation in the short term and more about precedent in the long term. If influence networks are allowed to operate unchecked around individuals connected to legacy, what message does that send? And how does one intervene without appearing punitive? This balance is difficult. Intervene too forcefully, and the institution appears controlling. Intervene too lightly, and it appears negligent. The solution, according to commentary from those familiar with similar situations, often lies in process rather than proclamation. As these considerations unfolded, attention increasingly returned to the youngest individuals involved. Their presence changed the tone of every discussion. Children introduce urgency without allowing for haste. Decisions affecting them carry weight that outlasts news cycles. Reports of internal preparations, however limited, fed this sense of rising stakes. Educational planning, wellness resources, and security assessments are not reactions to headlines. They are responses to possibility. Preparing does not mean assuming an outcome. It means acknowledging uncertainty. Public reaction mirrored this complexity. There was no single narrative that dominated. Instead, there was a quiet accumulation of concern, curiosity, and restraint. Many expressed a desire for clarity, but also an understanding that clarity in situations like this is rarely immediate. This period marked a shift from discussion to anticipation. People were no longer asking what had happened. They were asking what frameworks were being built behind the scenes, what safeguards were being considered, and how future decisions would be justified. The tension did not come from conflict alone. It came from the recognition that whatever happened would likely set a standard, not just for this family, but for how institutions respond when personal autonomy intersects with inherited responsibility. As patterns continued to emerge, the story took on a different shape. It was no longer about unraveling the past. It was about managing the future, carefully, deliberately, and with an awareness that every step would be examined, not just for its outcome, but for what it revealed about priorities. This is why attention did not subside. The situation had entered a phase where restraint itself was meaningful, and where the absence of dramatic action suggested that something more structured was taking form. Beneath the surface. As that structure began to take shape, the response from the wider public and from institutions beyond the palace followed a familiar, but still telling, pattern. There were no sweeping declarations, no coordinated statements. Instead, there was a gradual adjustment in tone and behavior across media, cultural, and professional spaces that had once been closely aligned with the figures at the center of the discussion. News coverage became noticeably more careful. Language shifted away from celebration or condemnation and toward qualification. Phrases like "according to public commentary," and "this has not been formally confirmed," appeared more often. Editors seemed intent on avoiding absolutes, aware that the situation was still unfolding and that early conclusions could quickly prove inaccurate. This caution did not reduce coverage, but it changed its character. Broadcast panels and long-form analysis programs focused less on personalities and more on systems. They examined how influence operates in elite circles, how narratives are protected, and how quickly those protections can dissolve when trust weakens. These discussions rarely named individuals directly. Instead, they explored patterns that viewers could recognize across industries, from politics to entertainment. At the same time, institutions that had previously partnered with or amplified certain projects began to reassess their positions. In most cases, this reassessment was not public. Schedules were adjusted, internal reviews were initiated. Some collaborations were quietly paused. Others were allowed to expire without renewal. None of these actions were framed as judgments. They were framed as standard due diligence in light of changing circumstances. This quiet distancing had a cumulative effect. Without dramatic announcements, the ecosystem around the story began to thin. Invitations slowed, coverage narrowed, the volume of promotional messaging decreased. For observers familiar with how reputational shifts occur, this pattern was recognizable. It was not a backlash, it was a recalibration. Public reaction followed a similar trajectory. Online discussions remained active, but the tone evolved. Early emotional responses gave way to longer, more reflective threads. People debated responsibility, not blame. They questioned how much weight should be placed on personal testimony versus structural context. Many expressed fatigue with simplified narratives and a desire for measured outcomes. One notable change was the emergence of concern-focused conversations. Rather than centering on adult conflicts, many discussions shifted toward the impact on younger family members. Commentators emphasized stability, privacy, and continuity. This reframing did not accuse anyone of harm. It acknowledged that prolonged uncertainty carries its own risks. Within legal and academic circles, hypothetical analyses began to circulate. These did not reference specific filings or outcomes. Instead, they explored how institutions can engage in protective oversight without overstepping, how cross-jurisdictional families navigate shared responsibility, and how public interest complicates otherwise private decisions. Institutional response, according to those observing from the outside, remained disciplined. There were no leaks designed to sway opinion, no anonymous briefings that sought to undermine credibility. This restraint was itself a signal. It suggested confidence in process over persuasion. Even ceremonial appearances took on new meaning. When senior figures attended routine engagements, their presence was noted, but their words were not expanded beyond the immediate context. The absence of commentary was interpreted as intentional, reinforcing the idea that decisions would emerge through formal channels, not through symbolic gestures. Media outlets that once relied on exclusives found fewer entry points. Access was limited, statements were scarce. This created a vacuum that some attempted to fill with speculation, but those efforts struggled to gain traction without confirmation. Over time, the lack of new material tempered the pace of coverage. What became clear during this phase was that the story had reached a point where reaction alone was no longer sufficient. Institutions were not responding to headlines, they were responding to potential futures. This difference matters because it shifts the timeline from days to months, from cycles to frameworks. Public patience was tested, but it largely held. There was an understanding, even among critics, that rushed conclusions could cause lasting damage. The absence of visible conflict suggested that conversations were happening where they belonged, away from cameras and comment sections. This is why the story continued to occupy attention without dominating it. It existed in a state of unresolved significance, present enough to matter, controlled enough to avoid escalation, and shaped secrecy. Anglai by what institutions chose not to do as much as by what they did. As this phase settled, it became evident that the situation was no longer about immediate reaction. It was about whether the structures being assembled could address the underlying concerns without creating new ones. That question, more than any individual statement, is what kept the discussion alive. As the immediate reactions settled into that quieter recalibration, a deeper question began to dominate the discussion. It was not about blame, reconciliation, or public image. It was about why this story, despite deliberate restraint and limited confirmation, refused to disappear. The answer lies partly in timing. This situation emerged at a moment when public trust in institutions, brands, and curated narratives is already fragile. Audiences are more skeptical than they once were. They are less willing to accept polished explanations without context, and more inclined to look for underlying systems rather than individual failings. When a story appears to expose tension between image and reality, it resonates far beyond the people involved. Another reason the story continues is its ambiguity. There are no definitive statements that close the loop, no final interviews, no legal rulings made public. Ambiguity creates space, and space invites attention. Each development, however small, is interpreted as a potential signal. Silence becomes meaningful. Preparation becomes suggestive. Even routine actions are read for subtext. There's also the unresolved issue of responsibility across generations. Stories involving public figures often fade when they center on adult disputes. They linger when children are part of the picture. This is not because of sensationalism, but because children represent continuity. Decisions made now shape lives for decades. Institutions understand this, and so do audiences. Public commentary has increasingly reflected this perspective. Discussions are less about who was right or wrong, and more about what structures best protect those who did not choose their circumstances. This shift has made the story harder to dismiss as mere drama. It places it within a broader conversation about duty, oversight, and long-term care. The institutional response, or lack thereof, has also contributed to the story's persistence. By avoiding reactive statements, those involved have signaled that outcomes will emerge through formal processes. This slows the narrative, but it also deepens it. Slow-moving stories tend to feel more serious. They suggest that decisions are being weighed, not improvised. Another factor is precedent. Observers recognize that whatever frameworks are applied here may be referenced in the future. Institutions rarely design solutions for one case alone. They design them for categories of cases. This awareness adds gravity to each reported adjustment or preparation. Media organizations, aware of this, have continued coverage without escalation. They return to the story not because of new revelations, but because of its implications. It serves as a case study in how modern public life intersects with inherited structures, global mobility, and evolving expectations of accountability. There's also the human element. Personal reassessment, when it happens publicly, invites empathy and scrutiny at the same time. Audiences struggle with how to respond. They want growth to be acknowledged without excusing harm. They want honesty without exploitation. This tension keeps conversations active as people attempt to reconcile conflicting impulses. At the same time, the absence of definitive closure allows multiple interpretations to coexist. Supporters, skeptics, and neutral observers all find room for their perspectives. No single narrative has been validated or discredited. This plurality sustains interest because the story feels unfinished. Behind all of this is the reality that institutions move slowly by design. Their pace can be frustrating, but it is intentional. Speed creates mistakes. Caution creates records. In situations where future scrutiny is guaranteed, records matter more than headlines. As weeks pass, attention may ebb and flow, but the underlying questions remain. How does an institution acknowledge personal distress without endorsing past decisions? How does it protect children without rewarding instability? How does it adapt to modern realities without eroding its own foundations? These are not questions with quick answers. They require legal interpretation, ethical judgment, and careful coordination across borders and roles. The complexity itself ensures that the story will continue, even if it does so quietly. This is why, despite limited information and deliberate restraint, the discussion has not faded. It touches on trust, legacy, and the limits of personal autonomy within public inheritance. It reflects broader anxieties about influence, protection, and accountability in a world where private lives are increasingly visible. As the situation continues to develop, the absence of spectacle may be its most defining feature. There are no rallies, no dramatic speeches, no sudden reversals. Instead, there is process, preparation, and patience. And in that slow unfolding, the story finds its staying power. What remains now is reflection, not just by those directly involved, but by the audience watching from a distance. Reflection on how much we expect institutions to intervene. Reflection on how much responsibility individuals carry when their choices affect others. And reflection on whether restraint in moments like this is a failure to act or a decision to act carefully. That reflection, more than any single event, is what brings this story to its current pause. Not an ending, but a moment of stillness, where the steps will matter more than the last words spoken. As the discussion reaches this quieter stage, it is worth noting how unusual this moment actually is. In an era defined by instant reaction and constant commentary, restraint has become the most visible choice. The absence of definitive statements has not resolved uncertainty, but it has slowed it, allowing space for consideration rather than conclusion. What stands out is not what has been said, but what has deliberately been left unsaid. No party has rushed to frame a final version of events. No institution has claimed moral victory. No individual has been publicly condemned or restored. Instead, there is a shared understanding, visible in tone if not in language, that whatever happens will carry consequences far beyond this moment. For the public, this creates an uneasy kind of engagement. There is curiosity, but also fatigue, concern, but also caution. Many viewers seem to recognize that drawing sharp conclusions now would say more about impatience than insight. The story feels unsettled because it is unsettled, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. There's also a growing awareness that not every conflict produces a clear resolution. Some situations evolve into long-term adjustments rather than decisive endings. Institutions adapt, Individuals reassess. Roles change quietly. Over time, what once felt explosive becomes instructive. In this case, the instruction appears to center on boundaries, where personal experience ends and public responsibility begins, where sympathy must give way to structure, where protection is offered without endorsement. These distinctions are not easy to maintain, but they are essential when legacy is involved. The presence of children in this narrative continues to shape how it is received. Their role is not symbolic, it is practical. Their futures will be influenced by decisions made now, often without their awareness. That reality demands a different pace, one that prioritizes stability over immediacy. It is possible that in time, formal outcomes will emerge. Legal decisions may be reached, arrangements may be clarified, public understanding may solidify. But even then, the larger questions raised here will remain relevant. How do institutions respond when private lives intersect with inherited roles? How much autonomy is compatible with shared legacy? And how does one correct course without rewriting history? For now, the story rests in a kind of holding pattern, not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening is procedural rather than performative. Files are reviewed, frameworks are refined, safeguards are considered. These are not actions designed to capture attention. They are actions designed to withstand it. In the end, this moment may be remembered less for what was revealed and more for how it was handled. The choice to observe rather than accuse, to prepare rather than proclaim, to acknowledge complexity rather than reduce it. As attention gradually shifts elsewhere, this situation will continue to exist beneath the surface, shaped by decisions made out of view. Its impact may only become clear years from now, when outcomes are measured not in headlines, but in lives shaped quietly by careful choices. For now, what remains is a pause, not an escape from responsibility, but a recognition that some responsibilities demand patience. And in that patience, there is a possibility, however fragile, of doing less harm than haste ever could. In moments like this, when attention begins to drift and the noise softens, the temptation is to look for a conclusion, a final statement, a clear outcome, something that allows the story to be filed away as resolved. But not every situation offers that kind of closure, and insisting on it can obscure what actually matters. What has unfolded here is not a spectacle. It is a slow reckoning with boundaries, responsibility, and restraint. It shows how easily private lives can become public concerns when legacy is involved, and how difficult it is to respond without causing further harm. There are no heroes in this narrative, and there are no villains. There are only people, institutions, and the long shadow cast by decisions made over time. The calm that now surrounds the story should not be mistaken for indifference. It reflects deliberation. It suggests that those with authority understand the weight of what they are handling. Silence, in this context, is not avoidance. It is an acknowledgement that words can do damage when used too quickly. For observers, this can feel unsatisfying. We are used to fast explanations and firm judgments, but the absence of those things here is itself instructive. It reminds us that some matters cannot be resolved through public debate alone. They require structure, patience, and a willingness to accept complexity. There's also a lesson in how narratives change. What begins as personal conflict can evolve into a broader conversation about systems, influence, and care. When that happens, the focus naturally shifts away from personalities and toward principles. That shift is uncomfortable, but it is often necessary. The children at the center of this discussion remain largely unseen, and that is as it should be. Their future will be shaped not by headlines, but by decisions made quietly, with their long-term well-being in mind. If this moment achieves anything lasting, it may be that it reinforces the idea that protection does not require spectacle, and care does not require validation. As time passes, new stories will emerge, attention will move on, but the frameworks being considered now will remain. They will inform how similar situations are handled in the future, long after the details of this one fade from memory. In that sense, the impact of this period may be more significant than it appears. For now, the story rests, not because it has ended, but because it has reached a point where reflection matters more than reaction, where listening matters more than speaking, and where the most important outcomes will likely be the ones that never become public at all. In a world that often rewards speed and certainty, this pause feels unfamiliar, but it may also be a sign of something steadier at work, a recognition that legacy is not preserved through force or denial, but through careful stewardship, and that sometimes the most responsible choice is to wait, watch, and act only when action truly serves the future.